3 million years ago, if you could travel to East Africa and look around, you would recognize some things. The sky would be the same sky. The stars at night would be the same stars, in the same positions. The sun would rise in the east and set in the west. The wind would carry the same smell of earth and grass that the African wind carries today. The Pliocene is also the period that modern climatologists study with particular attention, because it offers the best natural analog for the climate the Earth could have in the coming centuries if greenhouse gas emissions continue. In the warm Pliocene, between 3 and 4 million years ago, global temperatures were approximately 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher than today. Sea level was several meters higher, and Arctic regions were habitable by forests where there is now tundra. That warmer world existed without any human intervention, driven simply by slight variations in the distribution of land and sea and in the composition of the atmosphere. Studying it helps us understand what lies ahead. Tonight, as sleep arrives, we are going to explore that Pliocene world with the same calm with which the horizon of the African savanna 3 million years ago was contemplated by eyes already remotely similar to our own. Without urgency, with curiosity, with the willingness to let that world, at once so close and so distant, fill the space of the mind that is emptying as tiredness weighs on the eyelids. There is also something specifically human about the fascination the Pliocene produces. Other geological periods are fascinating for their strangeness, for the radical alienness of their organisms and landscapes. The Pliocene is fascinating for its proximity, because in that almost familiar world, recognizable in its broad outlines, there walks a figure we might recognize as remotely related to us. And that closeness makes the question not only scientific but also existential. What were we then? What are we now? What exactly are we in the process of becoming? But if you look down, toward the savanna stretching to the horizon, you would see something that would stop you cold. A figure, walking upright, bipedal like you, approximately 4 feet tall, with arms longer than you would expect, and a face that combines something familiar with something deeply alien. A forehead that receded quickly backward, a jaw that jutted forward, dark alert eyes beneath prominent brow ridges. It was not a human being. But it was not exactly what we would call an ape either. It was something between the two, something that evolution was slowly assembling in the savannas of East Africa 3 million years ago. It was an Australopithecine, and it was one of our direct ancestors. The period we are about to explore tonight is called the Pliocene, and it lasted from approximately 5,300,000 years ago until 2,500,000 years ago. It is one of the geological periods closest to us in time and at the same time one of the most transformative in the history of life on Earth. During the Pliocene, the continents settled into positions very similar to today's. The Mediterranean took on its modern shape. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were definitively separated by the Isthmus of Panama. And in Africa, a branch of the apes began to walk upright, to make tools, and to think in ways that 3 million years later would produce the human beings capable of looking back through time and wondering what that world had been like. Tonight we are going to explore that world, with the calm it deserves, with the attention required by a period that is at once familiar and completely different from our own. Because the Pliocene is not as remote as the Cambrian nor as dramatic as the age of dinosaurs. It is something closer and perhaps more unsettling. It is almost our world, but not quite. The Pliocene inherited a world that the previous period, the Miocene, had shaped over more than 18 million years. The Miocene was the period of great mammals, of the expansion of grasslands at the expense of forests, of the diversification of the ungulates and the carnivores that pursued them across those grasslands. It was also the period in which the great apes reached their maximum diversity, with dozens of genera inhabiting the tropical forests of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The African Great Rift Valley, the geological structure that cuts through East Africa from Ethiopia to Mozambique, is the setting where most of the story of the first hominids unfolded. This rift is a zone where the African crust is fracturing and separating, producing chains of active volcanoes, deep fault lakes, and mountains that create barriers to the circulation of moisture. The history of the African rift is also the history of the volcanoes that marked that landscape with their periodic eruptions. The volcanic ash from Pliocene eruptions is preserved in the sediments of paleoanthropological sites as white or gray layers that geologists can date precisely using radiometric methods. Those ash layers are the clocks that allow the hominid fossils found in the surrounding sediments to be dated, and their presence in the African sites is what makes possible the relatively precise chronology of Pliocene hominid evolution we have today. The importance of the rift for human evolution goes beyond simply being the place where the fossils were found. The hypothesis is that the specific geological and climatic conditions of East Africa, with its open savannas and seasonal lakes, its seasons of abundance alternating with seasons of scarcity, and the pressure of predators that had co-evolved with hominids over millions of years, created the specific selective pressure environment that favored the adaptations that would eventually lead to modern humans. The Pliocene Rift Lakes, which today include Malawi, Tanganyika, Victoria, and many others, were probably more variable in their level than they are today, expanding and contracting with climate cycles. That habitat variability could have selected for behavioral flexibility, the capacity to adapt to changing conditions, which is one of the most defining characteristics of modern humans. By the time the Pliocene began, approximately 5 million years ago, many of those things had started to change. The global climate was gradually cooling. The poles were becoming more permanently covered with ice. Grasslands continued expanding at the expense of forests. And in East Africa, the tectonic movements of the Great Rift were raising the mountains and plateaus that would divide the continent into a wetter, more forested western side and a drier, more open eastern side. That division, known as the African Rift Hypothesis, is possibly one of the conditions that allowed the evolution of the first hominids on the eastern side. The continents during the Pliocene were in positions very similar to today's. Africa was still moving northward, gradually meeting Europe at the Mediterranean. The Americas were connected by the Isthmus of Panama, which closed definitively approximately 3 million years ago. Australia was continuing its journey northward from the polar position it had occupied in the past. And Antarctica was already the frozen continent we know today, covered by an ice sheet that had been forming for tens of millions of years. The closing of the Isthmus of Panama was one of the most important geological events of the Pliocene and one of the most consequential for the history of life. Before that closure, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were connected through what is now Central America, and marine currents circulated freely between the two oceans. With the closure of the isthmus, those currents were blocked. The Gulf Stream strengthened, carrying more warm water northward into the Atlantic and modifying the climate of Western Europe and the Arctic. That climate modification caused by the closure of Panama was one of the factors that contributed to the onset of the Pleistocene glaciations, the period that followed the Pliocene. The climate of the Pliocene was warmer than today's world, especially in the first 2 million years of the period. Global temperatures were approximately 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher than today, and sea level was several meters higher. The poles had less ice than today, and the temperate regions were warmer and wetter. That warmer early Pliocene climate is of enormous interest to modern climatologists because it represents the conditions that climate models predict for the planet within a few centuries if greenhouse gas emissions continue at the current rate. Pliocene paleo-temperature records are obtained from multiple complementary sources. Oxygen isotopes in foraminifera shells extracted from ocean sediments are the most continuous and most widely used record. Magnesium isotopes in those same shells provide independent information about water temperature. Pollen records from continental lake sediments tell us what plants grew in each region and era. And fossils of vertebrates and invertebrates from terrestrial ecosystems give us qualitative information about climatic conditions through the known requirements of the organisms that produce them. Pliocene records also include evidence of extreme climatic events that disrupted ecosystems more abruptly than the gradual background cooling. Massive volcanic eruptions, megatsunamis produced by landslides on continental shelves, and medium-sized meteorite impacts all left traces in Pliocene sediments. Those events, though rare on the scale of millions of years, would have been catastrophic for the organisms living in the affected regions, and could have produced population bottlenecks that accelerated the evolution of some lineages. Pliocene paleoceanography has advanced enormously thanks to international deep ocean drilling programs, which have extracted sediments from the bottom of all the world's oceans reaching back to the Pliocene and beyond. Those sediments contain a wealth of paleoclimatic information that researchers have been extracting for decades and that continues to produce new discoveries. The combination of all those records produces a picture of the Pliocene climate that is far more detailed than could be obtained from any single source. That picture shows the Pliocene was not a climatically static period but one of considerable variability, with climate cycles controlled by the orbital variations of the Earth superimposed on the general cooling trend. Those orbital cycles, with periods of 41,100,000 years, produced variations in the distribution of solar radiation that translated into variations of climate and ecosystems that Pliocene organisms had to contend with. Pliocene climatic variability as a factor in hominid evolution is a hypothesis that has gained support in recent years. The idea is that periods of greater climatic variability, in which ecosystems changed more rapidly and less predictably, specifically selected for the cognitive and behavioral flexibility that characterizes the genus Homo. A hominid capable of modifying its diet, food-gathering strategies, and movement patterns in response to changing conditions would survive better than one with more rigid strategies. The Pliocene Mediterranean was already the sea we know today, with its characteristic elongated basin between Europe and Africa. Just a few million years earlier, the Mediterranean had been refilled after the Messinian salinity crisis, the extraordinary event explored in another documentary, and its waters were home to a marine fauna in the process of diverging from Atlantic species after the re-establishment of the Strait of Gibraltar. The major geographical regions of the Pliocene were recognizable in their broad outlines. The Sahara existed, though it was a smaller and greener desert in many of its parts than today, with periods of relative humidity when the Earth's orbital variations shifted the African monsoon northward. The Great Plains of East Africa were open grasslands broken by riparian forests along rivers and denser forests on mountain slopes. Asia was a continent of great contrasts between the humid tropical southeast, the arid center, and the cold north beginning to experience the first glaciations. The Pliocene seas were rich and productive. Modern whales, dolphins, and sharks already existed in forms essentially similar to today's. Coral reefs covered shallow tropical regions. Fish of many modern families filled the oceans from the surface waters to the abyssal depths. In that sense, the Pliocene was an oceanic world a modern sailor would have recognized in its fundamental aspects, though with differences in the details of species. The most fascinating characteristic of the Pliocene, the one that distinguishes it from all previous periods and makes it unique in the history of life, is what happened in the savannas of East Africa. There, in a lineage of primates that had been diverging for millions of years from the common ancestors it shared with chimpanzees, evolutionary changes began to occur that in retrospect we can recognize as the first steps on the road that would lead to human beings. The history of Australopithecine fossils is also the history of the science that studies them, a history of gradual discoveries that built an increasingly complex and nuanced picture of our Pliocene ancestors. Paleoneurology studies, the reconstruction of the brains of extinct hominids from the internal shape of their skulls, have revealed subtle but significant differences between the brains of different Pliocene Australopithecines. The inferior parietal lobe, a brain region involved in sensoromotor integration and in capacities like mental calculation and spatial understanding, shows slightly greater development in late Pliocene hominids than in early Pliocene ones. That incremental development of the parietal lobe could be the neurological correlate of the gradual improvement in tool-making and tool-use skills that the archaeological record documents. The first Australopithecine was described in 1924 by Raymond Dart, a South African anatomist, from an infant skull found in a limestone mine at Tong, in what is today South Africa. Dart named the specimen Australopithecus africanus and argued it was a human ancestor, a claim received with considerable skepticism by the scientific community of his era, which was not ready to accept that human ancestors could have skulls so similar to those of apes. Over the following 50 years, the accumulation of new fossils in South Africa, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, and other African countries built the picture we have today of the diversity of Pliocene Australopithecines. The discovery of Lucy in 1974 was the most famous of those findings, but it was not the only one nor the oldest. In subsequent years, the discovery of Ardipithecus ramidus at 4,400,000 years old pushed the record of relatively complete hominids further back in time, toward the late Miocene. Each new discovery adds complexity to the hominid family tree. Sometimes the new fossil fits perfectly into the existing tree, adding a new data point to a known line. Other times it reveals unexpected features that force a revision of the relationships between already known groups. The result is that Pliocene paleoanthropology is a field in constant motion, where the certainties of 20 years ago are often qualified or replaced by new interpretations supported by new evidence. Those primates were the Australopithecines, a group that in the Pliocene included several different species, each with its own anatomical characteristics and its own geographic distribution. The most famous Australopithecine is Lucy, the partial skeleton of a female Australopithecus afarensis discovered in Ethiopia in 1974 by Donald Johansen and his team. Lucy lived approximately 3,200,000 years ago, and her discovery transformed the understanding of human evolution. What made the discovery of Lucy so extraordinary was the combination of features her skeleton displayed. Lucy walked upright, of that there was no doubt. The shape of her hip bones, femurs and knees were those of a bipedal animal, designed to walk on two legs. But her skull was small, with a brain volume of just over 400 cubic centimeters, similar to a modern chimpanzee and far below the 1,300 cubic centimeters of the modern human brain. Her arms were proportionally longer than those of modern humans, probably still useful for climbing trees. And her teeth showed a mixture of primitive and more derived characteristics. Lucy and her relatives demonstrate something fundamental about human evolution: that bipedalism, locomotion on two legs, preceded the great increase in brain size in the history of our lineage. For millions of years, hominids walked upright with small brains. The great leap in brain volume would come later, in the genus Homo, from approximately 2.5 million years ago. In the Pliocene, the novelty was not intelligence but posture. Why the Australopithecines walked upright is one of the most fascinating questions in paleoanthropology, and the answer probably has multiple components. Bipedalism is not the fastest mode of locomotion nor the most energetically efficient for an animal of that size, at least not on uneven terrain. So what selective advantage did it offer? Tool use in modern non-human primates provides an important context for imagining what Pliocene Australopithecines could do with their freed hands. Modern chimpanzees use tools in multiple ways. They use stones as hammers to crack nuts, use stripped twigs to extract termites from their mounds, use leaves as sponges to collect water, and in some populations make and use spears to hunt small animals. The history of the earliest stone tools of the late Pliocene, found at sites in Ethiopia and Kenya dating between 3 million and 2.5 million years ago, is older than was thought just 20 years ago. These tools, named the Lomequian lithic industry after the Lomekwi site in Kenya where they were found, are more primitive and less standardized than the Oldowan tools associated with Homo habilis. Their discovery has forced a revision of ideas about who made the first stone tools, since their dating places them before the appearance of the genus Homo, suggesting they could have been made by Australopithecines. Those chimpanzee capabilities, documented in multiple wild populations in different parts of Africa, are in many cases culturally transmitted, meaning young individuals learn those skills by observing the adults in their group rather than discovering them independently. That means chimpanzee communities have local material cultures, with tool use traditions that vary from group to group and are transmitted from generation to generation. If Pliocene Australopithecines had cognitive abilities comparable to those of modern chimpanzees, as the similar brain size suggests, they probably also had some level of material culture, some tradition of tool use and possibly transmission of those traditions. Direct evidence of that tool use in the Pliocene is scarce because organic tools like those of chimpanzees do not preserve well in the archaeological record, but the presence of knapped stone tools at late Pliocene sites is clear evidence that by the end of the period hominids had made the leap toward deliberate manufacture of durable tools. One widely accepted hypothesis relates to thermoregulation. On the open, hot savannas of East Africa, an animal that walks upright exposes a smaller body surface to the midday sun, because solar radiation falls mainly on the top of the head and shoulders rather than across the entire back. Additionally, the upright posture raises the head above the hottest layer of air near the ground, taking advantage of breezes at greater height that make sweat evaporation cooling more efficient. A bipedal hominid could remain active during the central hours of the day, when the large four-legged predators sought shade, reducing both competition and danger. Another hypothesis points to the freeing of the hands. An animal that walks on two legs has its hands free to carry things: food, offspring, tools. That ability to transport resources while moving could have been a significant advantage in an environment where resources were dispersed and large distances had to be covered between them. Evidence that Australopithecines used stone tools is scarce and debated, but the ability to carry food and offspring with their hands could have been sufficient selection pressure for bipedalism. The famous Litoli footprints, in Tanzania, are perhaps the most evocative image of the Pliocene Australopithecines. Approximately 3,600,000 years ago, 2 or 3 individuals of Australopithecus afarensis walked across fresh volcanic ash that later solidified, preserving their footprints for millions of years. Those footprints are unmistakably bipedal. The big toe is aligned with the others, as in modern humans, and not in the divergent position of chimpanzees. They are human feet at a date 3.5 million years ago. While the Australopithecines were taking their first evolutionary steps in East Africa, the rest of the world was living its own Pliocene story, a story of diverse and in many cases spectacular fauna that had little to do with the small bipedal primates of the African savannas. The carnivore fauna of Pliocene Africa was also more diverse than today's, with several now extinct lineages that have no modern equivalents. Pliocene hyenids included forms larger than modern hyenas and also smaller, more specialized forms. Ursids, bears, had representatives in Africa during the Pliocene, though they are absent from the continents south of the Sahara today. And vivarids and herpestids, families of small carnivores, had a greater diversity of forms than today. Paleobiology studies of Pliocene African big cats have revealed that the relationship between saber-tooths and Australopithecines was not simply one of predator and prey. Analysis of marks on Australopithecine fossil bones has found evidence that in some cases saber-tooths consumed hominids after their death, and also that late Pliocene hominids accessed carcasses left by large carnivores to extract the marrow from bones. That klepto-parasitic relationship, in which hominids stole remains from large predator kills, could have been an important food acquisition strategy on the Pliocene savannas. The big cat lineage has an especially interesting history in Pliocene Africa. The leopard, cheetah, and lion all have their origins in or very near the Pliocene. Genetic studies suggest the lineages of those 3 cats separated between 2 and 4 million years ago, precisely in the Pliocene. During that period, those cats were co-evolving with the great herds of ungulates grazing on the African savannas, and each species was developing its specialized hunting strategies. the leopard as a solitary tree-climbing predator, the cheetah as a speed hunter, the lion as a cooperative hunter of large prey. That coevolution between predators and prey on the Pliocene African savannas is also part of the context in which the Australopithecines evolved. Those small bipedal hominids were not predators in the full sense. With their relatively small brains and without efficient hunting tools, they were probably opportunistic in their acquisition of animal protein, exploiting carcasses left by large predators, catching small prey when they could, and supplementing those protein sources with a mainly plant-based diet. At the same time, they were potential prey for those big cats. The danger of predation would have been a constant pressure on the lives of Pliocene Australopithecines, shaping their social behaviors and refuge strategies. On the grasslands of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, megafaunas lived with a diversity that has no equivalent in today's world. In Africa, elephants already existed in forms recognizable as ancestors of today's elephants, though coexisting with extinct forms like the African mammoth, smaller than the woolly mammoth but equally impressive. Rhinoceroses grazed on the grasslands and in the forests, in several different species. Giraffes already had their long necks and fed on acacia tops. Hippos inhabited rivers and lakes. And a diversity of antelopes, zebras, buffalo, and other ungulates formed the great herds that predators followed across the plains. Pliocene African predators included some extinct groups of great interest. The Megalodons, the large saber-toothed cats, were at their peak during the Pliocene. Homotherium and Megantherium were the African representatives of that group, large-bodied cats with long flattened upper canines that they probably used to wound their prey in the neck or flanks rather than biting the neck directly as modern lions do. In Eurasia, the Pliocene was a period of great faunal richness. Mammoths, which originated in Africa and spread through Europe and Asia during the Pliocene, coexisted with mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses in the colder northern regions, giant deer with antlers of extraordinary dimensions, and a great diversity of equids and bovids. The forests of Europe harbored bears, wolves, and various species of deer that in many cases were clearly distinct from current European species, though belonging to recognizable groups. The Great American Biotic Interchange was one of the most extraordinary faunal events of the Pliocene and deserves detailed exploration. When the Isthmus of Panama closed definitively approximately 3 million years ago, the faunas of North and South America, which had evolved in isolation for tens of millions of years, began exchanging species in both directions. The Great American Biotic Interchange that occurred when the Isthmus of Panama closed 3 million years ago was not only a faunal event but also a first-order ecological event that transformed the ecosystems of both Americas in ways still detectable today. The history of the Isthmus of Panama also has an oceanographic dimension of great importance for global climate. Before the isthmus closed, the surface waters of the western Atlantic and eastern Pacific exchanged freely through the space between the Americas. That exchange allowed the saltier Atlantic waters to mix with the more dilute eastern Pacific waters, moderating the salinity differences between the two oceans. With the closure of the isthmus, that mixing ceased, and the salinity differences between the two oceans began to amplify. That amplification of salinity differences was one of the mechanisms that intensified the Gulf Stream and contributed to the onset of the glaciations. The Great American Interchange also had consequences for the freshwater ecosystems of both Americas. Freshwater fish that inhabited the rivers and lakes of Central America began to diversify northward and southward as the land bridge created new dispersal routes. Many of the freshwater fish families found today in the rivers of Central America and northern South America reached their current distributions during or shortly after the Pliocene Great American Interchange. In North America, the arrival of giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, and other South American forms had no dramatic effects on the established fauna. Those large herbivores found available niches in North American ecosystems and integrated into them. But in South America, the story was different. The large North American carnivores, such as saber-toothed cats, bears, and wolves, encountered a South American fauna that had not co-evolved with such efficient predators. The result was a wave of extinctions among the endemic South American mammals that over the Pleistocene would eliminate many of the most characteristic groups of the continent. Camels are a fascinating example of North American animals that crossed southward during the interchange. Camels evolved in North America during the Tertiary, and during the Pliocene some lineages crossed into South America through the new Isthmus of Panama, where they gave rise to today's llamas, alpacas, guanacos, and vicuñas. At the same time, other lineages crossed in the opposite direction, toward Eurasia through the Bering Land Bridge, and there evolved into today's camels and dromedaries. The North American origin of camels, demonstrated by the fossil record, is one of the most striking examples of Pliocene biogeographic history. South America was a continent with an enormously peculiar fauna before the closure of the isthmus. It had evolved in complete isolation since the breakup of Gondwana, and its mammals included groups that existed nowhere else in the world. Macraucheniids were strange-looking ungulates that superficially resembled camels or tapirs but had no close relatives on other continents. Toxodons were large herbivores the size of a rhinoceros, with continuously growing teeth. Litopterns were ungulates that had evolved convergently toward horse-like forms. And glyptodonts, armored relatives of modern armadillos, were animals the size of a small car covered by a dome of bony plates. When the land bridge formed, North American animals began moving south. Mastodons, horses, tapirs, camels, bears, pumas. And South American animals began moving north. Glyptodonts, toxodons, giant ground sloths, armadillos, possums. The result was a faunal mixture that transformed both continents, though asymmetrically. Northern animals were generally more successful in the south than southern ones in the north, and many endemic South American groups ended up extinct in the following millions of years, possibly due to competition with immigrants from the north. Giant ground sloths deserve special mention. They were terrestrial relatives of today's sloths, but of completely different dimensions. Megatherium, which lived until relatively recently in geological terms, could reach 6 meters in length and several tons in weight, making it one of the largest land mammals in history. It used its enormous claws to pull tree branches down and access the leaves, or possibly to dig for roots. The Pliocene oceans harbored some of the most impressive predators in the history of the seas. The Megalodon, the largest shark known in the fossil record, existed during the Miocene and Pliocene, though it went extinct approximately 3,600,000 years ago, at the beginning of the late Pliocene. The extinction of Megalodon raises questions that go beyond the specific causes of its disappearance and touch on more general questions about the vulnerability of large marine predators. Paleontological studies of Megalodon's extinction show it was not an abrupt event but a process of gradual decline that extended over several million years. Megalodon populations became increasingly scarce and geographically restricted before disappearing completely. The extinction of Megalodon also coincided with important changes in cetacean diversity and distribution. During the Pliocene, baleen whales, which filter krill and small fish rather than actively hunting large prey, were increasing in size and number of species. That increase in baleen whales could be related to ocean cooling and increased productivity of cold waters, which would favor organisms specialized in exploiting krill in polar waters. At the same time, toothed whales, which compete with Megalodon for larger prey, also diversified during the Pliocene into the forms we know today. That pattern of gradual decline is consistent with the hypothesis that the extinction was driven by changes in prey availability rather than any catastrophic environmental perturbation. As the oceans cooled, the medium-sized whales on which Megalodon specialized were moving toward colder and more productive waters that Megalodon could not efficiently exploit. Without its main prey, Megalodon populations could not maintain their density, and the slow decline toward extinction was inevitable. The evidence of Megalodon's extinction also has implications for understanding modern marine ecosystems. In the Miocene and Pliocene oceans, Megalodon would have exerted top-down control on whale populations, regulating their number and distribution. The removal of that control with Megalodon's extinction could have allowed the increase and diversification of whales during the Pleistocene. That the largest known whales, the blue whales, evolved after Megalodon's extinction might not be a coincidence. Without the great shark that could have preyed on them when young, whales may have had the evolutionary freedom to grow even larger. Megalodon was a shark of proportions that are difficult to imagine. Size estimates based on fossil teeth, which is almost all that is preserved of sharks in the fossil record, suggest lengths of between 15 and 20 meters in the largest individuals, with a weight that could have exceeded 50 tons. Its mouth was large enough to contain a standing adult human. Its teeth, which could reach 18 centimeters in length, were tools designed to cut flesh and bone with equal efficiency. Megalodon was a predator specialized in medium to large whales. Evidence of its attacks is preserved in fossils of Miocene and Pliocene whale vertebrae and ribs showing bite marks perfectly compatible with the geometry of Megalodon's teeth. That shark was, in short, the greatest marine predator the history of life has produced. Why Megalodon went extinct is a question researchers continue to debate. The most popular hypothesis connects its extinction to the climatic cooling of the late Pliocene and the first glaciations. The cooling of the oceans reduced the productivity of the tropical and subtropical waters where Megalodon was most active, and the whale fauna on which it depended began to change, with larger whales moving toward colder polar waters where Megalodon could not follow them efficiently. At the same time, two new large predators appeared in the fossil record that could have competed with Megalodon for the same prey. The first orcas of modern size and an ancestor of the sperm whale with larger teeth than those of today's sperm whale. In East Africa, while Megalodon dominated the oceans and mammoths crossed Eurasia, something was happening that in retrospect was perhaps the most important thing about the Pliocene: the diversification of hominids and the first steps toward the emergence of the genus Homo. The fossil record of late Pliocene hominids in East Africa is concentrated in a few extraordinarily rich sites that have provided most of what we know about that critical stage of human evolution. The Omo River Valley in Ethiopia, Lake Turkana in Kenya, Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and the Afar Basin in Ethiopia are the four main centers of Pliocene-Pleistocene paleoanthropology. Analysis of foraging behavior in modern chimpanzees living in savanna environments, like those of Fongoli National Park in Senegal, provides a model for imagining how Pliocene Australopithecines might have lived in similar environments. Fongoli chimpanzees travel great distances in search of water and food in a more arid and open environment than most chimpanzee populations, and display adaptive behaviors that forest chimpanzees normally do not show, including using caves to shelter from heat and more nocturnal activity patterns to avoid midday extreme temperatures. Those behaviors could be parallels of the adaptations Pliocene Australopithecines developed to survive on the East African savannas. Paleodietary analyses of Pliocene Australopithecines have also revealed variations between individuals of the same species that suggest dietary flexibility. Not all Australopithecines from the same site had the same isotopic signal in their teeth, meaning different individuals consumed different diets, probably reflecting differences in resource access or individual preferences. That intraspecific dietary variability is characteristic of modern primates and suggests Pliocene Australopithecines were also individuals with their own dietary histories, not automatons with a fixed diet. Olduvai Gorge, where Lewis and Mary Leakey worked for decades beginning in the 1950s, is perhaps the most famous paleoanthropological site in the world. Its sedimentary layers, deposited in an ancient lake basin over millions of years, contain a nearly continuous sequence of hominid fossils and stone tools that documents the Pliocene-Pleistocene transition and the emergence of the genus Homo. The Leakey's discoveries at Olduvai, including Homo habilis and Paranthropus boisei, transformed the understanding of human evolution and demonstrated that East Africa was the cradle of humanity. Paleoenvironmental analyses of those sites, carried out through the study of sediments, animal and plant fossils, and soil isotopes, show that late Pliocene hominids did not live in a single stable environment but in a variety of environments that changed over time, from relatively dense riparian forests to open savannas with sparse tree cover. That environmental variability at the same site over time suggests the hominids of the period were capable of adapting to different conditions, supporting the hypothesis that behavioral flexibility was a key selection in the evolution of the genus Homo. The hominid family tree of the Pliocene is complex and remains under constant debate and revision as new fossils are discovered. Toward the end of the Pliocene, approximately between 3 and 2 million years ago, East Africa simultaneously harbored several different hominid species. There were australopithecines like Australopithecus africanus, with a slightly larger brain than Lucy's Australopithecus afarensis. There were the paranthropines, a lineage of hominids with enormous teeth and jaws adapted to chewing tough vegetation, seeds and roots, colloquially known among paleontologists as the robust hominids. And the first representatives of the genus Homo were appearing, with significantly larger brains and clear evidence of stone tool manufacture. Homo habilis is considered the first member of the genus Homo, though that classification is debated because its anatomy shares many features with the australopithecines. It lived approximately between 2,400,000 and 1,800,000 years ago, at the end of the Pliocene and the beginning of the Pleistocene. Its name, which in Latin means handy man, refers to its association with the first knapped stone tools, the so-called Oldowan lithic industry. The coexistence of multiple hominid species at the same time and in the same geographic location is one of the most fascinating and most puzzling aspects of Pliocene paleoanthropology. For millions of years, East Africa was home to several different types of bipedal primates with different dietary strategies, different brain sizes, and different anatomies. Only eventually, in the Pleistocene, did the genus Homo with its large brain and lithic technology begin to dominate, while the paranthropines and late australopithecines went extinct. The plant world of the Pliocene was in the process of transformation, driven mainly by the gradual climatic cooling and the expansion of grasslands at the expense of forests. That grassland expansion, which had begun in the Miocene and continued through the Pliocene, was one of the most important factors shaping the evolution of the period's mammals. The history of Pliocene grasses and grasslands also has implications for understanding plant domestication in the Neolithic, thousands of years after the period ended. The grasses that formed Pliocene grasslands are the ancestors of the cereals humans domesticated 10,000 years ago. Wheat, barley, corn, rice, sorghum, millet. Those plants had already developed, on the Pliocene grasslands, the characteristics that made them suitable for domestication. Large starch-rich seeds, growth habits that produced many seeds in a small space, and rapid growth capacity that allowed multiple annual harvests under appropriate conditions. The expansion of grasslands in the Pliocene also had consequences for the fire cycle in terrestrial ecosystems. Grasses, when they dry out in the dry season, form a large amount of fuel that in regions with seasonal rains can ignite easily and produce large-scale fires. Those fires, which became widespread with the expansion of grasslands, would have been a significant new ecological factor for terrestrial organisms of the Pliocene. Australopithecines and the first Homo of the late Pliocene would have regularly seen savanna fires, would have experienced the heat and smoke of those fires, and would have learned to respond to them. Fire was part of the Pliocene world, though it was not yet a tool in hominid hands. The coevolution between grasses and the large herbivores that ate them in the Pliocene also shaped the characteristics of those plants in ways that would later prove useful for humans. The large seeds, which in the Pliocene were adaptations for surviving herbivore digestion and germinating in the ground after passing through their digestive system, are also what makes cereals calorically dense and nutritious for humans. And the fire resistance of grasses, which in the Pliocene allowed them to recover rapidly after fires that large herbivores often provoked, is the same resistance that early Neolithic farmers exploited when they burned fields to prepare them for planting. The mixed forests of the Pliocene also produced fruits, nuts, and roots that formed part of the diet of hominids and many other mammals, and that would later be domesticated by Neolithic humans. The connections between Pliocene biology and Neolithic agriculture are less direct than the anatomical connections with the Australopithecines, but they are equally real. Grasses, the plants that form grasslands and meadows, are extraordinarily efficient organisms for surviving drought and intensive grazing. Their photosynthetic tissues are at the base of the plant, protected from herbivores that eat the upper leaves. They reproduce rapidly. They tolerate fire, which in African savannas is a regular ecological factor that grasses exploit because their arboreal competitors are more vulnerable to flames. And many grasses use a more efficient photosynthetic pathway than most trees and shrubs, giving them an advantage under conditions of high temperature and high luminosity. The expansion of grasses in the Pliocene drove the evolution of specialized dentitions in the herbivores that fed on them. Grasses contain silica in their tissues, an abrasive that rapidly wears down the teeth of animals that eat them. In response, Pliocene herbivorous ungulates developed hypsodont teeth, high-crowned teeth with abundant enamel that could remain functional for many years despite the wear produced by grass silica. That coevolution between grasses and the herbivores that ate them is one of the most beautiful and most documented examples of coevolution in the fossil record. The Pliocene forests also remained ecologically important, especially in the tropical zones and in the mountainous regions where humidity was greater. Central Africa maintained large tracts of tropical rainforest, home to the ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. Southeast Asia had its own rich tropical forests, and the temperate regions of Europe and North America had deciduous forests similar in composition to today's, though with some differences in the species present. The Pliocene was also the period when modern birds reached a diversity and distribution very similar to today's. Most of the orders of birds that exist today were already present in the Pliocene, and many of today's families had already differentiated. In that sense, the Pliocene sky would be recognizable to a modern ornithologist in its fundamental types, though the details of species would in many cases be different. Pliocene birds also included some forms especially relevant to the history of connections between continents. Migratory birds, which cross oceans and continents following the seasons, are vectors for the dispersal of seeds, parasites, and even genes between very distant populations. In the Pliocene, when the Isthmus of Panama closed and modified the migratory routes of many birds, those routes had to reorganize, with consequences for the distribution of many plant and animal species that depended on birds for their dispersal. Biodiversity records of Pliocene birds also show this was the period in which many oceanic islands received their first colonization by land birds arriving from the nearest continents. Those island colonizations, in many cases followed by evolutionary radiations that produced multiple new species in the same archipelago, added a dimension of diversity to the Pliocene fauna that the continental record alone does not capture. Songbirds, the order Passeriformes, which is the most diverse of all birds with more than half of known species, were already in full radiation during the Pliocene. Many of the songbird families that exist today, the finches, tits, blackbirds, thrushes, starlings, have their origin or main diversification in the Pliocene. And some of the most extraordinary characteristics of songbirds, like the ability to learn song by listening to adults of their species, which is one of the best-known examples of vocal learning in non-human animals, were already established in the Pliocene. The vocal learning of songbirds is of special interest for research into the origin of human language because it is one of the few known cases of vocal learning in animals, a process in which the individual listens to sounds produced by other members of its species and learns to reproduce them by modifying its own vocal production until it matches the model. Songbird brains have specialized neural circuits for that learning that are remarkably similar in their organization to the circuits of the human brain involved in language learning. Some Pliocene birds had no modern equivalent and deserve special mention. Pelagornis, whose history began before the Pliocene but continued into that period, was one of the largest known flying birds, with a wingspan of up to 7 meters that made it incomparably larger than any current flying bird. Its jaws had tooth-like projections that allowed it to catch fish and squid while gliding over the ocean surface with a soaring flight similar to albatrosses. The terror birds, the Forus racids, are another extraordinary Pliocene group. They were flightless running birds of up to 3 meters in height, with enormous hooked beaks, that inhabited the grasslands of South America during the Miocene and Pliocene and there occupied the ecological niche of large terrestrial predators that in other continents was filled by cats and other carnivorous mammals. When the Great American Interchange connected the Americas, some Forus racids reached North America, where they left their fossils in Florida sediments. But competition with the large carnivorous mammals of the north finished them off. The history of Pliocene birds also includes the first modern penguins and the first albatrosses in forms clearly recognizable as today's. The Pliocene seas, warmer than today's in many regions, also harbored some penguins at lower latitudes than those they inhabit today. That southward shift in penguin distribution was probably a consequence of the climatic cooling of the late Pliocene, which pushed their prey toward colder and more productive waters at higher latitudes. The climatic cooling of the late Pliocene, which began approximately 3 million years ago and intensified toward the end of the period, was one of the most important events in the history of the climate of the last few million years. That cooling was not linear or constant. It was a process of cycles of advance and retreat, with relatively warm periods interspersed with cooler ones, that together described a trend toward increasingly lower global temperatures. The late Pliocene cooling also had important consequences for the distribution of forests and vegetation across the planet. In the temperate regions of the northern hemisphere, the forests that during the warm Pliocene had contained a mixture of trees of both temperate and subtropical affinities, including many genera today found only in warmer regions, began to impoverish as the climate cooled. The cold-sensitive species disappeared southward or went extinct, and the temperate forests of the late Pliocene were already much more similar to today's in their composition. Studies of the Pliocene have also revealed that the climatic changes of that period were not uniform across the planet, but had complex regional patterns. While the northern hemisphere cooled and glaciations began, some tropical regions experienced periods of greater humidity related to changes in monsoon circulation. That regional variability of Pliocene climate created habitat mosaics that favored the specialization and diversification of many groups of organisms. The so-called extinction of the laurel forests in Europe is one of the most studied aspects of that late Pliocene floristic impoverishment. Laurel forests, forests of evergreen trees with large glossy leaves, similar to those that survive today in the Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores, covered much of Europe and the Mediterranean region during the warm Pliocene. The progressive cooling of the late Pliocene was reducing their distribution, first from north to south and then in intensity, until the Pleistocene glaciers eliminated them almost completely from continental Europe. The relict laurel forests surviving in the Macaronesian Islands are the last vestiges of the Pliocene European plant world. In Africa, the cooling and aridification of the late Pliocene had direct consequences for ecosystems and for the hominids living in them. Forests contracted toward the wetter zones, savannas expanded, and the rift lakes fluctuated dramatically in size. Those fluctuations created the variable and unpredictable environments that, according to some hypotheses, were the engine that drove brain expansion in the genus Homo. The evidence of that cooling is visible in multiple types of geological records. Arctic and Antarctic marine sediment cores show a progressive increase in sea ice extent during the late Pliocene. Antarctic ice cores, reaching back almost 1 million years, show the Antarctic ice sheet was thickening during the Pliocene. And continental sediments in many northern hemisphere regions show the first glacially derived deposits at latitudes previously too warm for glaciers. The most important mechanism for the onset of the Pleistocene glaciations, the period that followed the Pliocene, was probably the combination of the closure of the Isthmus of Panama and the changes in oceanic circulation that closure produced. The strengthening of the Gulf Stream carried more moisture to the Arctic and northern Europe, and that moisture precipitated as snow at altitude. If the snow falling in winter did not melt completely in summer, it accumulated year after year to form glaciers. And when glaciers reached a certain size, their white surface reflected more solar radiation back into space, amplifying the cooling in a positive feedback cycle that could lead to the massive expansion of the ice. That process, which began to unfold during the late Pliocene, would produce in the following 2.5 million years the enormous Pleistocene glaciations, when ice covered much of northern Europe, North America, and the highest points of mountain ranges around the world. The human species, which was evolving during that period of cooling and glaciation, would do so in the context of that changing and often inhospitable climate. The story of the Pliocene is also connected to something rarely mentioned when discussing that period: the history of our emotions. Pliocene Australopithecines were social animals living in groups, and the social life of primates implies a set of emotional and cognitive capabilities that, though we cannot read them directly in the fossils, we can infer from what we know about their brains, their anatomy, and the modern primates with which they are related. The history of emotions and sociality in Pliocene primates also has a dimension involving predators. The alarm systems of modern primates, which include specific calls for different types of threats, are highly sophisticated and allow group members to react appropriately to different types of threats. Vervet monkeys have different calls for eagles, snakes, and leopards, and the other vervets respond to each call with the behavior appropriate for that specific predator. Looking up at the eagle call, looking into the bushes at the snake call, climbing trees at the leopard call. The comparison between Pliocene primate communication systems and those of modern humans is also a way of appreciating the distance separating Australopithecines from us, despite their position as our direct ancestors. Human language is not simply a more elaborate alarm system nor a larger collection of calls. It is a symbolic system with grammatical structure, capable of referring to absent things, to past and future events, and to imaginary worlds. That capacity, which is the basis of human culture, science, and art, did not exist in Pliocene Australopithecines, however richer their communication systems were than those of other animals. Pliocene Australopithecines, living in open savannas with a diversity of predators including lions, leopards, hyenas, and wild dogs, would have had alarm systems probably comparable to or more sophisticated than those of vervet monkeys. The ability to communicate specific information about the type and direction of a threat to other group members would have been a survival skill of incalculable value. And that ability to communicate specific information through vocalizations, which in Australopithecines was probably richer and more complex than in any other non-human primate of their era, could be one of the precursors of human language. The hypothesis that human language has its evolutionary roots in the alarm and communication systems of Pliocene primates is one of the most attractive and influential in the evolution of language. Not because language is simply a more elaborate alarm system, which it clearly is not, but because the capacity to produce voluntary and varied vocalizations, and to learn the meaning of those vocalizations from the behavior of other group members, could be the cognitive substrate on which language was gradually built over the following millions of years. Australopithecines probably experienced something like fear, attachment, play, and curiosity. Modern primates, even with smaller brains than humans, show considerable emotional richness. Chimpanzee mothers show grieving behaviors when they lose their infants. Males compete for social status with complex strategies involving coalitions and negotiations. Young individuals play for hours in ways that develop physical and social skills. Individuals establish long-term relationships with family members and allies. If Australopithecines had social and emotional capabilities comparable to those of modern chimpanzees, and there are good reasons to believe this given their similar brain size and phylogenetic position, then the Pliocene was also the period in which something like maternal love, friendship, fear of danger, and the pleasure of play existed on the savannas of East Africa. Those experiences would not have been identical to modern human experiences, but they would have been more than mechanical reflexes. The evolution of sociality in hominids is one of the most active topics in paleoanthropology research. Fossil bones tell us about brain size and body shape, but tell us little directly about social behavior. However, the social group size of primates is correlated with the relative size of the neocortex, the part of the brain involved in processing social information. And the size of the Australopithecine neocortex, inferred from endocranial casts, suggests social groups of between 20 and 50 individuals, similar to modern chimpanzee groups. One of the aspects of the Pliocene that most directly connects us to the present is the marine fauna of that period, because many of the groups that existed then are the same ones that exist today, and because the Pliocene was the period when the modern oceans acquired much of their current character. The coastal and marine ecosystems of the Pliocene also influenced hominids in ways that the fossil record has begun to reveal in recent decades. Archaeological and paleoanthropological sites on the southern coast of South Africa, like those at Pinnacle Point Cave and Blombos Cave, show that prehistoric humans began exploiting marine resources, including shellfish, fish, and pinnipeds, more than 100,000 years ago in the Pleistocene. But there are indications that exploitation of coastal resources could have begun during the late Pliocene, with the first hominids of the genus Homo. The Pliocene coasts, with their estuaries, marshes, and mangrove forests, were also extraordinarily productive ecosystems that would have attracted late Pliocene hominids living in coastal regions. The richness of coastal ecosystems in terms of protein and fatty acids, with their diversity of shellfish, fish, seabirds, and eggs, makes them ideal food sources for omnivorous animals capable of exploiting varied resources. And the accessibility of many of those resources, which require neither the speed nor the strength of large carnivores, but simply the ability to gather stranded shellfish or catch fish in tidal pools, made them especially well-suited to Pliocene hominids. The coastal hypothesis also has implications for understanding why the first modern humans, when they left Africa approximately 60 to 80,000 years ago, probably followed coastal routes in their migration toward Asia and Oceania. That preference for coastal routes could reflect a long history of marine resource exploitation that began in the late Pliocene and that has made coastal ecosystems familiar and rich environments for hominids for millions of years. The coastal accelerator hypothesis proposes that access to marine resources rich in omega-3 fatty acids, especially those found in shellfish and fish, provided the nutrients necessary for the development of the large brain of the genus Homo. The human brain has an extraordinarily rich composition in long-chain fatty acids, especially docosahexaenoic acid, found in high concentrations in shellfish and marine fish but not in terrestrial plants. If the first Homo began exploiting coastal resources during the late Pliocene, that access to marine fatty acids could have contributed to the brain expansion observed in the fossil record of that period. Pliocene whales already included the main groups we know today: baleen whales, which filter water to extract krill and small fish with their keratinous baleen structures, and toothed whales, which actively hunt individual prey with their teeth. Sperm whales, dolphins, porpoises, all those families were represented in the Pliocene seas. Some of the species living then have changed little to today. The common dolphin, the bottlenose dolphin, and some baleen whale species have Pliocene relatives that are virtually indistinguishable from current forms. Pliocene sharks, beyond the already mentioned Megalodon, included the great white shark in a form essentially identical to today's. The modern great white shark evolved approximately 4 million years ago, during the Pliocene, and has changed relatively little since. That makes it one of the most morphologically conservative animals in the modern seas, an animal whose design was so successful that evolution has found no reason to significantly modify it in 4 million years. Pliocene bony fish also showed great similarity to today's fauna. Tunas, swordfish, billfish, sardines, herring, cod, all those families and many recognizable genera were already present in Pliocene seas. In that sense, a modern diver magically transported to the Pliocene Ocean would recognize most of the fish they saw, though the proportions of different species would be different since industrial fishing had not yet begun to modify the composition of marine communities. The Pliocene as a geological period ends conventionally approximately 2,500,000 years ago, with the onset of the Pleistocene, defined by the appearance of the first clearly glacial deposits in the northern hemisphere. But the processes that had characterized the Pliocene did not end on that date. The cooling continued, the glaciations intensified, and the hominids kept evolving. The transition from the Pliocene to the Pleistocene was not only a climatic change. It was also a change in the pace and scale of the evolutionary transformation of hominids. If the Pliocene was the period of precursors, of first steps, the Pleistocene would be the period of acceleration. The great brain increase, the expansion out of Africa, the conquest of environments completely different from the African savannas where the lineage had evolved. The legacy of the Pliocene in our biology also includes some of our vulnerabilities. The human back, with its frequent problems of pain and herniated discs, is the result of adapting a spinal column that evolved to be horizontal, like that of quadrupeds, to a vertical posture. That adaptation began in the Pliocene with the Australopithecines, and though it was enormously successful in enabling bipedalism, it left some design compromises that modern humans experience as back and knee pain. The Pliocene is literally in our bones, not only as ancestor but as the source of some of our most common physical limitations. The appearance of Homo erectus approximately 1,800,000 years ago is the event that most clearly marks that acceleration. Homo erectus had a significantly larger brain than Homo habilis, its body proportions were essentially modern, and its stone tools, the Acheulean industry with its symmetric hand axes, represented a qualitative leap over the simpler Oldowan tools. And Homo erectus was also the first hominid to leave Africa, reaching Europe and Asia approximately 1,800,000 years ago. That leap toward Homo erectus and out of Africa was possible because during the Pliocene the foundations had been laid. Bipedalism freed the hands, the Australopithecine brain established initial cognitive capabilities, and the pressures of the variable East African environment selected for behavioral flexibility and innovation. Without the Pliocene and its Australopithecines, Homo erectus would not have existed. And without Homo erectus, Homo sapiens would not have existed either. The legacy of the Pliocene in today's world is profound though rarely directly visible. The continental positions the Pliocene established are the ones we have today. The oceans with their major currents and their great faunas of whales, sharks and fish are largely the Pliocene oceans slightly modified. The mammal families that dominate the world's modern grasslands and savannas, the bovids, equids, elephants, carnivores, all have their ancestral forms in the Pliocene. And in the human family tree, the Pliocene occupies a central place. It is the period in which the human lineage definitively separated from the chimpanzee lineage. It is the period when the first bipeds walked the African savannas. It is the period in which the hominid brain began its expansion that would eventually produce the modern human brain. And it is the period in which the first stone tools appear in the archaeological record. Looking back at the Pliocene is looking back at a world that was almost ours but not quite. A world where the climate was slightly warmer, the oceans slightly higher, and the African grasslands harbored recognizable animals mixed with others we would not recognize. A world where something that might be called our ancestor walked upright under the African sun without knowing that its descendants, in an unimaginable number of generations, would explore the universe, compose music, build cities, and wonder what that world of 3 million years ago had been like. Research on the Pliocene is an active and constantly evolving scientific field, and each year new discoveries modify the picture we have of the period. In recent years, advances in radiometric dating techniques, stable isotope analysis, fossil computed tomography, and especially comparative genomics have transformed our understanding of hominid evolution during that period. Technological advances in the study of Pliocene fossils have produced in recent decades an amount of information that would have seemed impossible to researchers of previous generations. High-resolution computed tomography allows visualizing the interior of Australopithecine skulls without destroying them, revealing the shape of the brain from the internal surface of the skull that the brain impressed on the bone during development. Those virtual brain endocast images allow comparing the brain organization of Australopithecines with that of chimpanzees and modern humans. Advances in bioinformatics and artificial intelligence are beginning to transform Pliocene paleontology in ways that would previously have been impossible. Machine learning algorithms can now analyze the shapes of fossil bones in databases of thousands of specimens and detect variation patterns that human researchers could not identify manually. Those tools are producing new classifications of Pliocene hominids, revealing relationships between species that traditional visual analysis had overlooked, and providing more precise estimates of the populations and distribution of those species. Isotopic analysis of Australopithecine teeth has revealed detailed information about their diet. Carbon isotopes in dental enamel distinguish between plants that use the C3 photosynthetic pathway, which includes most trees and shrubs, and plants that use the C4 pathway, which includes most grasses and plants adapted to warm, arid environments. Pliocene Australopithecines showed in their dental enamel signals of a mixed diet that included foods from both C3 and C4 plants, suggesting they exploited both forest and savanna resources. That dietary opportunism is consistent with the image of Australopithecines as flexible animals capable of exploiting a variety of resources in a variable environment. Paleogenomics, the study of DNA preserved in ancient fossils, has transformed our understanding of late Pleistocene human evolution, but its applications to the Pliocene are still limited because DNA degrades over time and rarely survives millions of years. However, the study of ancient proteins preserved in dental enamel, which are more stable than DNA, is beginning to produce information about the biology of Pliocene organisms that no other method could provide. Comparative genomics, the study of the genomes of current primates to infer the evolutionary history of their ancestors, has produced some of the most important surprises in recent paleoanthropology. Comparison of the genomes of humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans has allowed estimating the divergent states between those lineages with a precision that the fossil record alone cannot provide. Those studies indicate that the lineages that would lead to chimpanzees and to humans separated between 4 and 7 million years ago, that is, toward the end of the Miocene and the beginning of the Pliocene. But genomics has also revealed something unexpected about that separation, that it was not a clean and unique event. The genetic data show evidence of gene flow, that is, of interbreeding between the ancestral populations of humans and chimpanzees, in phases subsequent to the initial separation. That suggests that for thousands or tens of thousands of years after the two lineages began to diverge, their populations still occasionally encountered each other and produced fertile hybrid offspring. Only gradually, as the genetic and possibly geographic differences accumulated, did the separation become complete. That history of gradual separation with intermittent gene flow is far more complex than the simple image of an abrupt separation at a specific moment. And it suggests that the story of hominid origins in the Pliocene was probably more complicated and more nuanced than fossils alone could reveal. The Pliocene also teaches us something about the scale of time in terms that are relatively accessible to human intuition, because 3 million years is a period we can try to represent in ways that bring it closer to our experience. The temporal perspective of the Pliocene also becomes more manageable when thought of in terms of the changes that occurred in the period on shorter timescales. The Pliocene climate did not change uniformly across its nearly 3 million years. It changed in cycles, with warmer and cooler periods succeeding each other rhythmically. Those climate cycles had periods of 41,000 years in the early Pliocene and 100,000 years later, driven by variations in the Earth's orbit and rotational axis. The Pliocene also invites reflection on the nature of change and persistence. In 3 million years, Australopithecines evolved to produce the first representatives of the genus Homo. In 3 million years, Megalodon disappeared and the great white shark took its place as the ocean's largest apex predator. In 3 million years, the African grasslands acquired much of their current extent, the large mammals inhabiting them diversified and specialized, and the planet's climate experienced multiple cycles of cooling and warming. Those changes, so large when described, occurred so gradually that no observer living in the Pliocene would have noticed anything. Generation by generation, the Australopithecines simply lived their lives without knowing they were changing. Change was invisible from within because it was slower than any individual life. Only from outside, from the perspective of geological time, do those changes become visible as the dramatic process they were. 41,000 years is the period of one complete climate cycle in the early Pliocene. 41,000 years are approximately 1,600 human generations. If a family had a complete photo album of all its ancestors, with a photograph of each generation, reaching the beginning of a Pliocene climate cycle would require leafing through an album of 1,600 pages. A Sunday afternoon would be enough to pass from one to another all the imaginary portraits in that ancestral chain, and at the end you would be at the other end of a complete climate cycle. That representation makes the Pliocene something more tangible. Not as something distant and inaccessible, but as something that can be mentally traveled, step by step, generation by generation, from the present backward. And at the end of that mental journey, on the other side of 120,000 generations, lies the African savanna of the Pliocene, with its Australopithecines and its mammoths and its Megalodon in the ocean, as real as anything that exists today, though no one is there to see it. If we represented the history of the universe from the Big Bang as a single calendar year, the appearance of Pliocene Australopithecines would occur in the last minutes of December 31st. If we represented the history of the Earth as a 24-hour day, the Pliocene would begin at 11:57 at night, and the 3 million years of the period would occupy barely the last 2 minutes of the day. But there is another way to represent that time that is equally instructive. 3 million years are approximately 120,000 human generations. If an average generation is 25 years, 3 million years equals 120,000 generations. If each generation were represented by a person standing with arms extended forward and backward to connect with the person of the previous and next generation, the chain of people from a Pliocene Australopithecus to a modern human would have 120,000 people in length. That chain is long, but it is not unimaginably long. A medium-sized city of 120,000 inhabitants could house all those ancestors in its streets. And if lined up in a row, the chain would be about 100 kilometers long, the distance between Madrid and Toledo, or between Los Angeles and San Diego. A distance a car covers in an hour. That spatial representation of genealogical time has something reassuring about it. Our connection with the Pliocene Australopithecines is not an inaccessible cosmic abstraction. It is a chain of people extending 100 kilometers, each of whom was the son or daughter of the previous one, each of whom lived, breathed, felt fear and curiosity and attachment, and passed something on to the next link in the chain. The Pliocene, explored tonight, is also a mirror. We look back at that period, and in it we see both what we are and what we were not yet. Australopithecines were our ancestors, but were not us. They had our bones in a proto-human form, but not our capacity for language, art, mathematics. They lived in communities, but not in cities. They did things with their hands, but not the things we do with ours. The Pliocene also has a dimension rarely mentioned. It was a period in which the beauty of the natural world, in a strictly ecological sense, reached levels that the modern world, impoverished by the extinction of megafauna and the fragmentation of habitats, can no longer match. Thinking about the Pliocene is also a practice of humility. Not the humility of feeling insignificant, which is discouraging, but the humility of understanding one's own position in a larger story, which is liberating. Pliocene Australopithecines did not know what they were in the context of the history of life. We do know, or at least we know more. We are the result of that 3 million year process, but we are also a point in the continuation of that process which has not ended. What we are now is not what humans will be a million years from now, if they still exist. That perspective does not make the present less real or less important. It makes the present what it is, a moment in a long process, as real and as valuable as any other moment in that process, but not the end or the final destination. The African savannas of the Pliocene harbored herds of large mammals whose density and diversity has no equivalent in today's world, not even in the most pristine African national parks. Herds of thousands of herbivores of dozens of different species, followed by a diversity of carnivores that included types that no longer exist: the saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenids, the African bears. The Pliocene African skies were inhabited by scavenging birds and raptors of a greater diversity than today, responding to the abundance of megafauna death that those ecosystems constantly produced. And in the Pliocene oceans, before industrial fishing began to modify marine communities, the schools of fish and the populations of whales, sharks, squid, and other organisms were of an abundance we can today only imagine from the historical record of the first European navigators, who described seas that literally teemed with life. The Pliocene, with Megalodon still present in its waters, was an ocean where the ecological balance between large predators and their prey was still the one evolution had established without human disturbance. That lost beauty of the Pliocene is not only aesthetic nostalgia. It is also a reminder of what ecosystems can be when the evolutionary processes that created them operate without interference. And it is, perhaps, a source of inspiration for imagining what those ecosystems could become again if we gave them the space and time to recover. And yet, something in those Australopithecines was already irreversibly different from all the other animals of their time. They walked upright in a world where no one else walked that way. They carried things with their hands. They probably communicated emotions and situations to their group companions with sounds and gestures of a sophistication greater than any other non-primate animal. And they lived long enough, in groups large and complex enough, for something like culture, like the transmission of learned behaviors from one generation to the next, to begin to operate. Paleoanthropologist Richard Wrangham has proposed that the control of fire, which appears in the archaeological record approximately 1 million years ago, though perhaps earlier, was the transformative event that allowed the great brain increase in the genus Homo. Cooking food makes it more digestible and allows more calories to be extracted from the same amount of food. A hominid that cooked could maintain a larger brain without needing an equally large digestive system, because cooking does part of the work that the intestine would otherwise do. In the Pliocene, that control of fire did not yet exist, or if it did, it was so sporadic and so unsystematic that it had not transformed the diet and physiology of hominids. The Pliocene is, in that sense, the period immediately before the Great Leap. The period in which the conditions were being established for something unprecedented in the history of life to occur. The emergence of a species capable of reflecting on its own history, of imagining worlds different from the one it inhabits, of planning long-term and of communicating complex information through a symbolic system. Pliocene Australopithecines could not imagine what was incubating in their lineage. But that inability to imagine the future is also what makes their story so deeply human. There is something serene in the story of the Pliocene that makes it especially suited to accompany the descent into sleep. It is not the serenity of an empty world or a world without life, but the serenity of a world full of life that does not know it is historical, that does not know someone will look at it from the future with curiosity and wonder. The calm that comes from contemplating the Pliocene has something to do with scale and something to do with continuity. With scale, because 3 million years puts any human concern in perspective in a way that relieves without numbing. And with continuity, because the Pliocene is not a lost and disconnected world but the visible root of the tree we live in. The ecosystems of the Pliocene did not disappear without trace. They were gradually transformed by cooling, glaciations, and more recently by human activity, but they maintain a continuity with today's ecosystems that study of the period reveals clearly. The African savanna of today, though impoverished by the extinction of many of the species that inhabited it in the Pliocene, is still organized according to the same ecological principles as then. The same relationships between herbivores and plants, between predators and prey, between seasonal fire and the structure of vegetation. And in the bodies of the human beings falling asleep tonight, the Pliocene continues in other ways. The hip bones, designed for bipedalism on the African savannas 3 million years ago, support the weight of the body. The hands, freed by that same bipedalism for more delicate tasks, rest while the fingers, with their unique fingerprints that are an ancient primate trait, gently touch the sheets or the pillow. And the eyes, which at some point millions of years ago specialized for color vision and binocular depth perception that tree-dwelling primates needed, close slowly as sleep arrives. Pliocene Australopithecines did not know they were the link between apes and humans. The mammoth herds crossing the Eurasian steppes did not know they would go extinct. The Megalodon hunting whales in the early Pliocene oceans did not know it was the last of its species to dominate that niche. All those beings lived in their present with the same completeness with which we live in ours, without projection toward the future and without memory of the past beyond what their nervous systems could retain. That way of life, completely installed in the present, is something human beings have largely lost. Our capacity to project into the future and to remember the past is one of the most defining characteristics of our species, and it is also one of the most important sources of our anxiety. Pliocene Australopithecines had no anxiety about the planet's climatic future. Mammoths did not worry about their extinction. Megalodon did not anticipate its disappearance. There is a lesson in that, though not one that can be extracted directly or applied without nuance. Full presence in the moment, life without the weight of the imagined future or the excessively remembered past, is a way of being in the world that Pliocene animals illustrated perfectly without knowing it. And that way of being, that attention to the present without anxious projection, is also what is sought when sleep arrives, when the mind releases its elaborations and the body rests in what simply is. The Pliocene continues, in some way, in the present. Its African grasslands are the ones that today still harbor the great mammals that survived the Pleistocene. Its oceans are the ones that today fill the basins the period helped configure. And its hominid lineage is us, the humans who tonight look back through time and see, 3 million years back, a small upright figure walking under the African sun toward a destiny that neither of us could have imagined. Tonight we have explored the Pliocene, that period 3 million years ago that was almost our world but not quite. We have seen Lucy and her relatives walk upright across the savannas of East Africa. We have seen the great American biotic interchange mix the faunas of 2 continents that had evolved separately for tens of millions of years. We have seen Megalodon dominate the oceans before its extinction. We have seen the first glaciations of the Northern Hemisphere announce the world of ice that was to come. The Pliocene was the period in which the roots of what we are as a species were established in African soil, under a sun that still shines over those same savannas, over the same rift volcanoes that dusted the sediments with ash where the bones of Lucy and her relatives now rest. That sun, those savannas, those volcanoes, all still there. What Pliocene Australopithecines began is still here too, in this body resting tonight, in this mind that finally quiets. And we have seen, above all, the paradox that makes the Pliocene such a particularly fascinating period, that it was the period in which the history of our species began, in the sense that the first hominids clearly related to us were walking then, and at the same time it was a period completely alien to any human history, because those hominids had no history in the sense we understand it. The Pliocene reminds us that we are the result of a long and contingent process. That the Australopithecines who walked at Litoli 3,600,000 years ago did not know their lineage would produce humans. That at each branching of the hominid family tree, small accidents could have led to completely different outcomes. That the world that exists today, with its cities and its music and its science, was not the only possible world. It was simply the one that happened. That can produce vertigo, or it can produce calm. The calm of knowing that we are here and now, in this moment, the result of 3 million years of a chain of lives that passed something on, something that had been passed to them and that eventually arrived at this present instant. This breath, this night, this descent into sleep. The Pliocene ended 2.5 million years ago, but its traces are still here. In every bipedal step on the earth. In every curious glance toward the sky. In every moment of care between people who love each other. Those things, which Pliocene Australopithecines practiced without name and without awareness of being special, are still the most important things we do. The world continues. The night goes on. And sleep arrives on the foundation of everything that came before. If this journey kept you company, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark.